Welcome, everybody. I'm Lori Wallach from Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and I am thrilled to be hosting this panel, which is about how we got to this situation that we are in, the impact of failed trade policies and deindustrialization on BIPOC communities. This panel is going to explore some of the history of trade policies and reflect on what a new worker and environmental centered industrial policy could look like. And before we start, let me just ask everyone to please feel free to share your thoughts and your questions. Submit questions for the speakers in the chat box. Please use the chat to get your 2 cents in and ask questions. And now please welcome our panelists. Valerie Wilson, PhD, is the director of the program on race, ethnicity, and the economy at the Economic Policy Institute. Sandra Polaski, PhD, senior research scholar at Boston University. William Spriggs, PhD, who is the chief economist of the AFL-CIO. And Todd Tucker, PhD, director of government studies at the Roosevelt Institute. So with this panel, we're going to look at trade policy and its impacts broadly. We know for the past decades, trade policy has been dominated, US trade policy has been dominated by a narrow group of wealthy, largely corporate interests at the expense of workers and consumers, both here and internationally. And the takeaway that a lot of people are coming to is that this is not a natural consequence of globalization. This has to do with what rules and who wins and who loses under those rules. This is a deliberate set of policy choices. So this panel is going to talk about what the outcomes have been and then what different policies could have different outcomes. Decades of these corporate rigged trade policies have harmed many people around the world, Americans and people in other countries who are working people of all races and ethnicities. But we found in looking at the actual job loss data and the income data related to trade in a report last year called Trade Discrimination, the disproportionate underreported damage to US Black and Latino workers from US trade policy, that Black and Latino workers in the United States have been overrepresented, both in the industries most direly impacted by these particular trade policies and by the regions and communities in the country. And the punchline that, bears restating, but is not news, is that whole countries, whole economies don't prosper when entire communities of people are excluded or exploited, and when working people don't have the tools to innovate and do their best work. So trade agreements have been an impediment. They could also become a powerful tool to incentivize the investments and the behaviors that would create a stronger economy that could lift up everyone, create climate resilience. And the more inclusive trade policies alone certainly won't fix the challenges, for instance, facing Black workers. But we, as part of addressing the underlying economic and structural racism that has been part of the bigger picture, certainly must also take into account the actual trade policies and related broader industrial policies and other signals that we send in the global economy, but the rules we set for the global economy. So to get started, I'm going to ask all of our speakers one framing question, which is basically the theme of the panel. Why do trade and manufacturing matter to racial justice? And I'm going to let folks volunteer their order of speaking versus calling anyone out unless no one volunteers. So any volunteers to start?
I'll volunteer.
Thank you, Sandra.
Lori, let me focus on the trade aspect for the moment, and let me give a little historical context to answer the question. US trade policy for about 3 decades after World War II was largely about reducing tariffs, which was good for US exports and the way the global economy was structured at the time, and it contributed to US job creation. Workers of color got some of the jobs in those export industries, which were often unionized and paid family supporting wages. However, in the 1970s, 1980s, as part of a general shift in the economic and political ideology in the US to so-called shareholder capitalism and profit maximization at any cost, US trade policy was gradually captured by US financial and corporate interests that wanted protection for their investments and production overseas. This included many things people are probably familiar with: investor state dispute settlement mechanism to protect investments, strict corporate intellectual property rights, constraints on foreign countries' ability to regulate or favor their own producers, measures that in effect made it safe for US companies to eliminate good jobs in the US and offshore them to other countries, especially low-wage countries. Tax policies, which were also the result of the ideological shift in corporate lobbying, lowered taxes rather on overseas profits compared to domestic profits, creating further perverse incentives to offshore jobs. US corporations lobbied for these trade and tax provisions and aggressively took advantage of them, sending millions of good manufacturing jobs to other countries. These US corporations broke the social contract with US workers, which hurt all workers who lost their jobs. But as usual, in our racially unequal society, the impact was especially harsh on workers of color, many of whom had just gotten their foot on the first rung of the ladder to economic security. US trade policy was part of the policy shift that pulled the rug out from under them.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call on Valerie and do the women first, if Valerie's ready, please.
Sure. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be today at this time. I'm going to start by stating the obvious. There's little that doesn't matter to racial justice in this country because of our long history and the ongoing legacy of racism that permeates every aspect of life in the United States. Large and persistent racial disparities in employment and pay are actually defining features of the US labor market and major contributors to the racial income gap and by extension, the racial wealth gap. So any policy or practice that affects the availability of good jobs, and in particular, good jobs that don't have restrictive requirements or don't require a college degree, for example, have major implications for racial and economic justice. Nearly 2/3 of all workers in this country and closer to 70% of Black workers and 80% of Latino workers have less than a 4-year college degree. And about 70% of those employed in manufacturing industries are those with less than a 4-year college degree. So those are jobs that have historically been widely available to workers across the economy. And historically, they've also been more likely to be union jobs, as Sandra already mentioned. That gives workers more power to bargain for better pay, better benefits, and better working conditions, all of which have been and will continue to be important to narrowing racial wage and income gaps.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And gentlemen, Bill, what you want to dive in?
Sure, I will. Thank you, Lori. I will dovetail on both Sandra and Valerie's points. As you mentioned, work that you did last year, looking at data from trade adjustment assistance filings. So you were looking at workers claiming direct impact and documenting direct impact, but other economists using different methods, looking at those industries that were most open to competition with Chinese imports and then mapping those into local communities, noticed that there was a big job loss in those communities most exposed. And work that I have just released with students of mine, Nyanya Brown and Bethel Cole, took that same approach, but used a different data set so that we could look at the racial implications. And as Sandra and Valerie both say, then this overlays a job market in which competition for high wage jobs has a racial component to it for the reasons Valerie laid out. And what we found was that indeed there was a slightly bigger impact on Black workers. Their share of jobs in the exposed sectors dropped. But more importantly, it changes the dynamic in the local labor market because we've now removed the high wage jobs and the competition becomes a zero-sum game about who gets the next best jobs. And what our research finds is, as theory would predict, the share of Blacks in the next set of jobs initially went up because the system has been shocked, workers reallocate themselves. But in the long run, it was that Black workers got chased to the lowest wage sectors. What happened when you look at the time span, and economists have been very misleading in talking to people about the impacts of trade, from about 1967, when we reached sort of a peak in economic activity in the US, until the beginning of the 21st century, there were 17.5 million Americans in manufacturing jobs, roughly on average. I mean, there are business cycles, but it's 17.5 million. Economists, of course, have said, well, the share doing manufacturing has dropped. So these people are just complaining because it's technology and, everything changes. But it's the number. Technological advancement took place at a faster rate over that period than since the 21st century. But in that 5-year period from like 2002 to a 7-year period from 2002 to 2009, we lost over 5 million manufacturing jobs. That's not technology. And what American workers experienced was this sudden shock where those jobs disappeared, not because they got displaced by machines. So here's the key. That zero-sum game then has this ripple effect that Black workers got chased to the lowest wage sector, but also totally out of the labor force. So the share of Blacks in private employment also fell. And most importantly, the wages of Black workers were chased down. So the big adjustment for Black workers, slightly different than for white workers, was that this was an impact on private sector employment in the long run, wages in the long run, and the expansion that we got from the Great Recession in 2008 forward was not as robust in those communities that were most impacted. So there's a lasting scarring that takes place in those communities for the rate at which Blacks got hired and their access to these jobs. So anything you do in disrupting an equilibrium is going to create new equilibrium, and those aren't always going to be good ones. And in this case, for Black workers, it had disproportionate impacts.
That is pretty damn devastating. We're going to come back and visit that, because that level of detailed new research is exactly what I think a lot of people have been looking for to be able to think about some of the policy issues to address those bad outcomes. Todd, may I please ask you to address the opening question?
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much. Really happy to be here with all of the sponsors of this event and with Lori, who's taught me so much about trade policy over the years. We've heard a little bit about sort of the content of some of the trade agreements over the last 3 or 4 decades. And my portion of what I'm bringing to the table today is to talk about industrial policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I define and think about industrial policy. But in a nutshell, it's basically the opposite of what's in a lot of these trade agreements. Instead of leaving it to corporate CEOs to decide how production works and where production is located, it's about having a democratically accountable and democratically decided plan for the economy. And how does this tie in with race? Part of the reason that the U.S. has not had a successful industrial policy over the course of its history, at a time when so many of our competitors have had one, is because of the lingering effect of slavery and institutional racism. John Quincy Adams, who was a big advocate of sort of Alexander Hamilton style industrial policy, had this to say about the slave power and why it was dead set against any sort of successful national level industrial policy. Had national industrial policy been allowed to work, quote, the blessings unceasingly showered upon the people by this process would so grapple the affections of the people that it would, in process of time, overshadow that of state governments and erode the slave power. Slavery stands aghast at the prospective promotion of the general welfare. So, and I think you see this so much today that, a lack of faith in government's ability to engage in meaningful industrial policy is reflective of the general distrust of government that years of division and sort of this regional slaveocracy has had over the course of U.S. history. So I'll leave it for the opening and then circle back to some of these themes later on.
Thank you all for those initial inputs. The first place I'd like to dig a little bit deeper is to go back to Bill Spriggs, please, and sort of take on something that we found to be just wrong in the data that you mentioned that we found when we did our analysis, and which was very superficial compared to what you just done. Which is to say that trade has been described inaccurately as a white working class issue. And there's been a whole conventional wisdom around that has then started to steer the policy and the politics. And I mean, what we found in our study was that just looking at geomapping where the trade adjustment assistance, the people actually certified by the government for having lost a job to trade, were disproportionately in the parts of the country and the communities that were diverse as compared to a very small portion in the very white parts of the country. So if you can just tell us more from your more detailed research, how did bad trade deals like the North American Free Trade Agreement or permanent normal trade relations, privileged trade status for China, impact workers and more broadly whole communities of color?
So thanks for that question. Our paper has this wonderful sort of heat map that shows those communities most impacted in the 21st century, looking at the impact of China trade. And yes, the heat map looks sort of like the Confederacy because it's the eastern coastal southern region where almost a majority of Black workers live. So the impact was felt most heavily there. And it gets back to Todd's point. Part of what we're going through at this moment, because we have new technologies that are pushing their way into the policy space, is a worship of inequality and trying to explain why CEOs should get paid zillions of dollars more than regular workers, why it's okay for Jeff Bezos to be a quad billionaire. The rest of us still struggle if you work at Amazon. That philosophy on the part of economists helped to mask the sort of brutal inequality driven by these trade deals and to present the inequality as good. This is an advancement. We're all winning from trade. And what your work showed, our work showed, and others have shown is not quite. There are definite losers, and we have misled the American people as to how much is being lost and what the costs are. And we explained to workers that somehow or another their sacrifice is good for the rest of us. And that's not real consolation for those who are in those communities with lower high wage jobs. When you do the analysis we did, you divide up between those sectors most exposed to trade, and those are the highest wage sectors within those communities. When I mentioned we went from 17.5 to 12.5 million manufacturing workers, At the beginning of the 21st century, we had 17.5 manufacturing workers. We had 9 million restaurant workers. In February of 2020, when we had the big shutdown, we had 12 million manufacturing workers and 12 million restaurant workers. This is the transformation that took place in the 21st century when technology and everything is supposed to be so important. We went from high wage manufacturing to restaurant being equal in size. And so that shows the sort of perverse backwards industrial policy that Todd is talking about. What kind of industrial policy would increase investment in restaurants, decrease investment in manufacturing? And the result for Black workers was a shifting towards the lowest wage sector and out of the private sector. So there are more costs than economists have been honest in presenting to people. And there are real losers. And no, the 5 million manufacturing workers were not greeted with 5 million more computer programming jobs. That's not how it turned out.
I'm really looking forward to digging into that data, and so appreciate that you did that research. And folks are asking for a link for your paper if you want to paste it in to the chat. You've got some eager readers already, besides yours truly. And I think that myth and the data that you have sort of behind it is going to be incredibly helpful for policymakers. Just as a sort of an aside, having done a ton of focus groups on trade and jobs and manufacturing issues, to me, it was a super interesting area of actually sort of affinity to see focus groups both in North Carolina and manufacturing areas for working class voters and pockets of splitting out different demographics. One of the few areas also in eastern Wisconsin where the auto sector jobs used to be was to actually have some interesting notion amongst white working class voters that African-American workers in their plants had actually gotten it worse, had been laid off first. And that was just an interesting insight to actually see what was other super polarized focus groups, to see that on the ground in the plant awareness that was basically taking on the myth of, oh, it's just the white working class folks who got hurt. Valerie Wilson, your research has focused in on some questions that are very important for the policy in this area. What has your research been showing about the characteristics of manufacturing jobs for Black workers?
So when we talk about the characteristics of manufacturing jobs for Black workers, it's important to understand those characteristics in the context of the alternative. And Bill has already spoken some about this. So let's start with annual earnings. And in particular, we'll look at annual earnings for non-college educated Black workers in manufacturing compared to those in non-manufacturing industries. When we look at the 10th percentile of annual earnings, and that would include some of the lower wage workers in the industry, we find that earnings are twice as high in manufacturing for those workers than in other industries. So again, even for the lower wage workers, when those jobs go away, they're shifting into jobs that pay about half as much. The difference is a little less dramatic at the median, but again, looking at non-college educated Black workers in manufacturing, they earn about 18% more than the median Black worker in other industries. When we look at access to important workplace benefits like healthcare or health insurance, 57% of non-college educated Black workers in manufacturing have employer provided health insurance compared to just 40% of similarly educated Black workers in other industries. So again, these jobs are important in terms of pay, in terms of access to these important benefits. And in fact, it was the availability of better paying manufacturing jobs in the Midwest and in the Northeast that was a major factor in the Great Migration and Black workers moving from the South to these cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. And these jobs were also important to narrowing racial wage disparities in the Midwest in particular. In 1980, the Midwest had the smallest Black-white wage gap in the nation. Unfortunately, in the years since, those gaps have widened and widened to the point that they're now closer to wage gaps that we see in the South, which historically has been the region of the country with the largest or the worst racial wage gaps. Research by John Bound and Richard Freeman in the 1990s documented the fact that for non-college educated African-American males in the Midwest, they were also hurt most during the 1980s, largely because of the loss of manufacturing jobs that also coincided with declining unionization. My own research, Bill referenced that post-2000 period, has shown that there's been a continuation of this trend with these worsening wage gaps in that region. Over that same time, another troubling trend that some research I'm working on with my colleague, Rob Scott, has revealed is that over that period of time, there's been a decline in Black workers' share of total manufacturing jobs, especially as the jobs that didn't go offshore moved south and moved west. From the late 1970s to about early 1990s, the Black workers' share of manufacturing employment was roughly consistent, if not greater than their share of the total workforce. But since then, they have become increasingly underrepresented in manufacturing jobs relative to their share of the workforce. Currently, Black workers are about 11% of the workforce, but less than 9% of manufacturing employment. I make that point because it's important, again, to understand that in contrast to other workers, and again, thinking about jobs moving into a region of the country where a majority of Black workers are, they should at least be maintaining the share that they had before, but it's declining. In contrast, white and Hispanic workers' shares of manufacturing employment have remained, fairly consistent with their representation in the total workforce. So the combination of trade policy and what's happening internally in the country as the jobs are moving from one region of the country to another is having major effects on the wages of Black workers, as well as access and availability of good paying jobs.
Yikes. So the data is really compelling, and it's terrific that you guys are doing this research to elevate it for everyone to see. It then starts to beg some of the questions of the causation and the cures. The causation that goes perhaps beyond the structural racism you've both spoken about that has gone into hiring, firing, wage, and other decisions. And to that end, Sandra, I'm going to ask you a question as somebody who's been in the US government and has been in the ILO, trying to think about, because one of the underlying questions that's puzzled me is this disparate impact and damaging outcomes, particularly for Black workers from our trade policies, a factor of the other deep structural racism in the whole set of employment policies and choices and incentives? Or is there something about these agreements in addition, or these policies in addition, so that you know which things need to be fixed? And I'm wondering, in your experience of the actual policies, the trade policies and agreements, if there are particular things that you think have been particularly problematic in this respect, and account for some of the disparate impact, and what things perhaps could be done to try and remedy, and if not for the disparate impact, for workers writ large. Sandra.
Oh, well, thanks, Lori. I think I would focus in on 4 areas to try to answer your question. First and most broadly, trade policy has been seen and treated in US policy debates as if it were a separate foreign economic issue. But in fact, it's obviously part of the broad economic approach and philosophy and ideology of the country, which, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, and everyone knows, really shifted from a sort of post-war Keynesianism to a neoliberal view that gave corporations basically what they wanted to dominate the world. Part of the solution here is that trade policy has to be shrunk back to be a part of overall US coherent economic policy if we're going to address the kinds of issues that are in front of us. For example, the racial problems, the damage done by long-term social and labor policies, now by the pandemic and by climate change as it arrives here. And Todd will probably say more about this, but the US had an overall plan in industrial policy as recently as the Franklin Roosevelt administration, and it continued under Eisenhower, even Nixon. But with the neoconservative tilt beginning in the 1980s, there was a radical ideological rejection of that approach, and the role of the state was whittled back. However, there were, in fact, unacknowledged industrial policies that doled out favors to different sectors and firms, depending on their political influence and power. These included the financial sector, pharmaceutical sector, agricultural sector, and increasingly big tech. They more and more wanted to be able to stride the globe, and in order to deliver the market access they wanted and the overseas protection for production overseas, the US began to pursue this aggressive policy to change other countries' policy space for economic planning, which then redounds to constrain our own space. Now the US badly needs an economic plan and domestic industrial policy to rebuild the economy from the pandemic, from the lingering effects of the 2008 financial crisis, and from decades of bad policy choices, including policies that harmed communities of color. Without a plan, the US will drift back to a harsh, unequal, discriminatory, and unstable economy that had been building for years and that reached historically precarious levels during the Trump administration. I think the Biden administration has started to construct a coherent plan with many aspects of industrial policy and the American Rescue Plan and the proposed American Jobs and Family Plans. But as it embarks, and here's where we come to the need for change in trade policy, as it embarks on a corrective economic plan for the US, the administration will face many of the constraints on intellectual property, on industrial policies, and others that the US itself insisted upon at the WTO and in bilateral free trade agreements. As a first step to address these constraints, the US has offered to negotiate over a waiver of intellectual property protections for coronavirus vaccines at the WTO, a good step. But there are other trade agreements that constrain that and other clauses in trade agreements that will continue to limit the availability and affordability of pharmaceutical products, both related to the virus and more generally. There are also trade rules that allow retaliation by other countries against subsidies, preferences for domestic producers such as Buy American, and other measures that are part of President Biden's plans. These agreements will also allow private firms to sue governments, including the US government, over supposedly lost profits due to policy changes that may be made. The US will need to seek waivers or renegotiate these terms in order to rebuild the economy, and certainly if it intends to build back better. The new agreements should eliminate ISDS entirely and pare back the excessive protection of corporate intellectual property and other measures that prevent or punish good regulation at home and abroad. Those clauses prioritize the interests of investors and corporations over the interests of workers and communities and must be rebalanced under a new trade policy. The second point, after paring back these damaging provisions, new and renegotiated trade agreements should aim for a set of clear and simple rules that encourage upward convergence of living standards by allowing all trading partner countries adequate policy space for achieving equitable growth and development. This includes strong protections for workers' wages as well as other worker rights. New agreements should explicitly permit measures against social dumping, for example, low wages that result from wage repression regimes, like the one that prevailed in Mexico until recently. A new agreement should also include provisions to counter climate change, including through border taxes on carbon to prevent environmental dumping. Third, enforcement of trade agreements has been very aggressive when dealing with protections created for multinational corporations, while it has been weak with regard to labor and environmental clauses. This has begun to change with the notable example of labor enforcement provisions in the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which adopted the sound idea that enforcement should be targeted first at individual firms and facilities before targeting at whole countries, because it's the firms themselves that are the direct perpetrators of harm to workers. Putting their market access at risk can align the interests of firms more closely with those of workers and the public. And it can also create a deterrent effect, as other firms see the potential cost of labor violations and correct their practices in order to continue to export to the US market. The USMCA provisions are just now starting to be tested, so we'll see whether these new enforcement mechanisms are a good template to follow or need further strengthening. Fourth and finally, many of the worst problems facing US workers today stem from deficiencies in our own labor laws, labor policy, and social protection systems that are the result of deliberate policy choices. The US social contract, the overall set of rights that should guarantee a decent standard of living and acceptable working conditions, was severely frayed by trade and other neoliberal policies, and now it's in tatters. And it always had serious gaps for workers of color. There is no trade policy that will work for workers if the fundamental faults of US domestic labor, social, and racial justice policies are allowed to continue. If I have a minute, and if not, we can come back later. I'd like to mention one directly related policy, which is trade adjustment assistance. Do I have a minute now, Lori, or should we come back later?
Let us reserve that thought for just 1 minute so we can get Todd in, and then we will come back to TAA if we may.
Good.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And for, Todd Tucker's coming up next. The question really is how we can change what, it was bad industrial policy is a way to frame it into the policies that we get the outcomes we want, particularly given the opportunities about building a more green economy and the climate challenge. And if folks have not read Todd's excellent work in industrial policy published in various articles, I highly recommend it. Todd, please, what are those opportunities that can, in this climate money is out there moment, also deal with these lasting racial inequities?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. So maybe just take a quick step back. I know we only have a few minutes left, but just to define what industrial policy is, because it kind of gets slung around quite a bit. But we define it as any policy that pulls resources from one industry into another. So in other words, it's any policy that is not neutral from the kind of governmental and democracy perspective as to which industries rise, which industries fall, and how industries produce the goods and services on which we all rely. So every country has an industrial policy, whether they admit it or not. Military in the US, military procurement and intellectual property protections of the kind that Sandra was just discussing. For drug makers, these are all types of industrial policies where the government is putting its thumb on the scale of which industries rise and falls. So every country has it, including the US, whether they admit it or not. But why are we hearing sort of this focus in the last year or so of more conversation of industrial policy? There's a few reasons. One is that it's just become so clear how many of our economic competitors are pursuing industrial policies. In 2015, China announced its Made in China 2025 policy, which is all about securing Chinese dominance in a handful of industries. That same year, the European Union announced an official policy of encouraging governments in the EU to adopt national development banks that would fund startups, would fund green technology, and that was an explicit industrial policy for that they wanted to see in each EU country. That's one reason. A second reason is the climate crisis. The crisis has become so advanced that there's literally no way to decarbonize on the timescale needed unless government sort of directly reaches into firms and factories and replaces obsolete technology with technology that will help us decarbonize. And on some level, both that economic transformation is represented in both the Green New Deal and in Joe Biden's Build Back Better plans. So those are some of the factors that are leading to sort of more conversation about this now. You know, the interest in the U.S. Of industrial policy has been cyclical over time. And as I mentioned sort of at the outset, racism has had a huge role in keeping the U.S. from developing a federal level industrial policy. Most recently, the most recent time we had conversation about industrial policy in the 70s and 80s, you know, the neoliberal economics profession basically killed it dead. And part of the problem was that the advocates of industrial policy were focusing disproportionately on industries that were employing white men and not giving an attention to other industries that were more diverse. And also sort of the folks talking about it were disproportionately white men. So I think that, you know, part of what you can see with the Green New Deal is an effort to flip that, to sort of really address those dynamics head on. So lastly, like, how does all this relate to the topic of our conversation today on trade policy? As I mentioned, in some ways, industrial policy is the opposite of what we've seen with trade agreements over the last number of decades. You know, if neoliberalism uses the power of the state to service elites and protect markets, industrial policy at its best constrains and constructs the markets that we want to see. And so that's why a key plank of Build Back Better is actually about modernizing the trade agreements so that they're in service of sort of this sectoral industrial policy strategy rather than operating as a constraint. So indeed, I think the lesson that a lot of policymakers are taking is that, you know, the era of NAFTA and WTO, we just, you know, exposed manufacturing workers to grinding competition, kind of assuming, as Bill and others have said, that the service sector would just create those good jobs of the future that would be high paying. But I think the lesson of the last number of decades is all of us, I think, have been saying in one way or another, is that you can't just assume that corporate elites are going to create those jobs. And you really have to have a dynamic interface between your manufacturing and service sector, which of course employs the majority of folks, you know, so that those are working together and in tandem. I also dropped in the chat, I think people can see it, links to both sort of a paper we did from 2019 that goes into these things in a little bit more detail, as well as a piece from my former colleague, Kendra Bozarth, that highlights some of sort of the dimensions of racial injustice that we discuss in the report. So I highly encourage everybody to look at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Todd. And actually, the first audience question, because ladies and gentlemen, we're moving to that part of the panel. It's time for Q&A. And panelists, get ready too. The first question actually follows right off of what you just said. So please take a crack at it, and then others, of course, jump in. So the question is, it seems that we've been chasing viable alternatives to replace manufacturing as an economic driver for 40 years. First, it was services and knowledge economy, then it was big tech, etc. Throw in the AI and big data angle. What is the path back to putting manufacturing front and center?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, what we're seeing from the G7 declaration, the Group of Seven declaration from a couple of weeks ago, as well as sort of the Build Back Better plans, the era of sort of ignoring manufacturing is over. You know, I think that it actually is increasingly front and center. And, you know, that's for a lot of different reasons. There's national security reasons. I think the COVID showed that we sort of are desperately dependent on very geographically concentrated sources of supply for a number of very important products, be that rare earths or be that semiconductors. You know, that we've basically allowed corporations in the US and elsewhere to kind of decide where to source and where to locate their production completely independently from any sort of democratic or national security focused consideration of where that needs to be located. So I think that, you know, it's a good question, but I think in, you know, 2020, it actually is, for the first case in many decades, that there is more of a focus on manufacturing, and not only just the very cutting edge high technology sectors, but I think there's also a sense that, you know, even for more run-of-the-mill chips that we put in cars nowadays, that like we need to have a lot of that here as well. And the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that passed the Senate on a bipartisan basis this month is a kind of a first step, I think, towards reversing some of that. I think what I'd like to see from that act as it moves through Congress is a lot more focus of the kinds of things that the administration put in its supply chain review, which is a lot more social conditionalities attached to that money as it's going into industry. It's not enough to kind of just say that you're going to locate in America, although that's very important. It's also important to have things like card check neutrality so that we can build unions in all of these sectors. So that's what I'm going to be looking for in the months ahead.
Super helpful. I would love for others to jump in, but let me throw out the second question so that can also inform what other speakers, other panelists want to contribute. And the second question is, did the loss of manufacturing jobs and changes in technology contribute to forcing people out of the labor force altogether? And in what way was that then exacerbated by lack of access to training opportunities?
I think we don't want to talk about it from that perspective. This idea that everything can be solved through training is part of this neoliberal myth that is the way forward. That's how you make these adjustments. And the idea that you can give up manufacturing jobs and then you can train people for some high wage sector jobs. What has chased people out is the drop in aggregate demand resulting from the loss of jobs. What has chased people out is that we simply don't have spread out sufficient consumer demand in all of our communities to keep employment up. That is the root cause here. And as Todd was mentioning, it was an implicit industrial policy that we kept the minimum wage low, making restaurant workers progressively cheaper relative to their history as workers and relative to the wages of everyone else, and that we ignored issues of competition policy to guard against the barriers to entry that new firms face in so many industries, and in part as the type of thing Sandra was talking about through intellectual property rights, with the result that we essentially carved out and created this huge vacuum into which the restaurant industry sucked so much resources of our economy. So no, this has nothing to do with training. This is everything to do with we didn't plan. We were quite content to let those who were wealthy get wealthier. And we surrounded ourselves with these myths that reinforce inequality is good, outcomes that create more inequality are good. And on a racial lens perspective, and Todd pointed this out before, and Valerie pointed this out before as well, unfortunately in the United States, when inequality is good, that means that racialized policies are good. And that's part of the reason why Black workers get left out when we discuss manufacturing jobs, because then you'd have to talk about racial equity and you'd have to talk about Black manufacturing workers on the same footing with white manufacturing workers. But then that disturbs this narrative that people want to give about inequality is good. Racial inequality is good by implication, because it means that we're rewarding those who are the most productive. And by inference, Black workers are never the productive workers. And we break solidarity. We break the ability of workers to remain together in understanding the experience that they're all having, Black or white, and we keep people from having a united response to this isn't good for Black or white workers.
Let me jump in here also to the question from one of the audience about some of the real hardship that's been experienced as a result of loss of manufacturing jobs, deindustrialization, and specific trade impacts. It's important to recognize that sometimes, and in fact it's often, these impacts are very concentrated in local communities. So a company that was a big manufacturer in a small or medium-sized city that employed the largest number of workers in that city goes out of business because of trade or goes overseas, which was more typical, and leaving that community. That concentrated loss of jobs has a devastating impact, not only on those workers, but on all the workers there. Those workers have to find work. They are now competing for the not very good service sector jobs that are available. They take money out of the economy, as Bill was saying, demand reduces. And in many cases, they don't have the skills to move. And let me come back to trade adjustment assistance, because that was supposed to solve that problem. Or they can't move for reasons of family commitments, having houses that are underwater because the whole economy has collapsed low. So you have these very harsh concentrated effects. The Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which has existed for over 50 years, was designed to address those impacts, and it has failed woefully. It does not provide enough assistance to the workers. The training is not matched with jobs available. And there has never been a direct job creation component in it. So if you train people, there are no jobs. They've actually lost whatever service sector income they could have got during those years of training. Many people don't participate. Anyway, it's generally not been successful. I just want to put in a plug here, because the Ways and Means Committee Democrats have just introduced a bill, the TAA Modernization Act of 2021, that begins to really take on some of these problems. And in particular, I would point out that it establishes a TAA, Trade Adjustment Assistance for Communities program, that provides funds to communities to recover and to create jobs directly if necessary. And it also requires outreach to historically underserved communities, and it mandates innovative data collection on worker outcomes by race to better inform policymaking. So it's a positive sign, and I just wanted to make the participants here today aware of that.
Thank you for that, Sandra. Valerie, do you have some comments you would like to add? We are just getting to the last 5 minutes, and I only need 30 seconds to wrap up. So we'd love to hear more from you if you'd like.
Sure, I'll jump in on the question about people leaving the labor force, and agree with Bill's comments about reduced aggregate demand, and just the lack of available jobs has been a factor in that. But along with that, another sort of outcome of inadequate demand has been lower wages or declining, suppressed wage growth. And I think now, and where we are currently more than ever, people are recognizing the importance of the availability of affordable care. So people being able to go to work. So when you have a situation where people are earning less, so that if you do go to work, what you earn from work may very well be less than what it costs you to go to work, because you have care responsibilities that you have to fill in the meantime. I think that's a bigger issue in thinking about how we boost labor force participation or increase employment in our current environment than, say, training people for these newer high-tech jobs would be. So I think that's a part of the infrastructure in this country that I'm glad is getting more attention now, and moving forward will be important as we think about our broader, more comprehensive economic and labor, trade, industrial policies in this country.
Thank you very much, Valerie. I think it's just listening to the panel, it's an exciting time to see some of the shifts that we are in thinking, to be more supportive of the importance, for a variety of reasons that our panelists have described, for industrial policies at least intentional, to use Todd's definition, policies that are thinking intentionally about where you want incentives, investments, jobs, what kind of jobs, and what kind of an economy, and to have more support for manufacturing. I think that the research, the very rich research that we've heard from our panelists today, can help inform the kind of policies that might address the previous inequalities and damage to working people writ large, but disproportionate impact to workers of color. And also, I think there's a lot of work to do. because I want to follow up with what Todd mentioned about that bill from the Senate, the so-called China bill. So if everyone ever remembers the movie Dr. Dolittle and the push me, pull me critter, which was going at two directions at the same time, that bill has a bunch of the things Todd described, yet still in that bill, clearly not as informed by the research and thinking on this panel, are, for instance, the same day as the supply chain review is announced for pharmaceuticals to start reshoring that work, and the science and production behind it is a crazy set of removal for 2.5 years of all tariffs, including penalty tariffs, on imports of the entire pharmaceutical supply chain, from active pharmaceutical ingredients to the finished meds. And so we're doing this on one hand and this on the other hand. And so I think that what also Todd said about the terms and conditions of the government investment, super important. There's a lot of money going into semiconductors, but is it going to be union jobs? Is it going to be, where is it going to be? Where is the investment? How long does it have to stay? Are there clawbacks? These are the kinds of policies that really, as we think forward about what kind of an economy do we want to build, what does the rich research of these panelists say we need to do? What lessons must we learn? This is the ongoing discussion. So I want to thank the panelists for their contributions, both today and also their amazing research. I want to thank our audience for your interest and your questions. Yes, there were more, and I am going to, after thanking everyone, just wrap up. And I'd like to hand over the chairing to Elmer. So thank you, everybody, very much. And Elmer, you're on.
Thank you so much, Lori. Thank you, panelists. That was just a phenomenal conversation. I feel like I just got a whole life's worth of education just listening to you all. So to all of you still in this room, I'm so excited for the next part of our experience together. We are going to separate into multiple smaller rooms, and we're going to invite you to use the Whova app to navigate into them. So at this time, we invite you to join a networking and brainstorming fun experience during an interactive breakout session. Our goal is for you to come ready to meet people, share your ideas, learn from one another, ask questions, answer questions, and so on. During these sessions, you're going to have a group leader who's going to prompt you with questions and sort of facilitate the conversation. It's comprised of our team and all the organizers from this event. So I expect you're going to enjoy it. Prompts during these small breakouts include sharing examples of actions that have made a difference for racial inclusion, your thoughts on how the Biden administration can improve the future, and what areas of the conversation about manufacturing, the environment, and racial equity need to be vitally amplified. So I'm going to give you some very, very specific instructions on how to navigate to it. So follow along. If what I'm saying makes sense, feel free to drop off this portion of the call and go into that place. Looking at